Hello and welcome to another episode of What's for Dinner. The world's a strange and interesting place right now. Should I be wearing a mask while I record this? I don't know. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and check the link in the description below. Not only will you find a step-by-step recipe for today's video, but you'll have access to all the recipes that I've cataloged at fnscooking.com. Today we're doing an American classic with a little bit of a spin. Meatloaf is the wonderful dish with a terrible name, and we're going to try to dress it up a little bit, bring it into the modern world. Now, we're not going to do anything too crazy, but I am going to wrap it in bacon and we're going to glaze it in ketchup, amongst a few other things. This is going to be very similar to the meatloaf that your grandma made, but it's a little bit more modernized, and it's a very, very tasty recipe. It's also easy to pull off and very quick to put together. So, that said, let's get to the cooking. So the first thing you may notice with this recipe is that it's a fairly hefty recipe. 3 pounds of ground meat and a pound of bacon is not a small meatloaf, but I find this is somewhat necessary because everything cooks better when it's of a certain size. You could scale this down, and as I narrate this, I want to talk about everything by pound of ground meat. That's kind of how I've broken this recipe down. That way it can be scaled up and down fairly easily. So this is 2 pounds of ground beef and 1 pound of ground pork. Next, we're going to add in some eggs. The eggs act as a bit of a binder. It just helps hold everything together. You don't really need it for the fat content and the yolks in a recipe like this. That's what the pork is for. But it just helps hold everything together and give you a nice solid loaf that you can cut into nice slices. Next, we're going to start with the seasoning. This is black pepper. It's about a teaspoon per pound of ground beef. Next up, we have some granulated onion. This is about a tablespoon per pound of beef or meat. And I like the granulated a lot better than the powdered. I think the flavor is better and it mixes in better. This is some paprika, once again about a tablespoon per pound. Next we have some dry herbs, both rosemary and dry thyme, and it is about a teaspoon per pound. And you notice I'm being very general, everything's about, because a recipe like this doesn't require like crazy accurate measuring. It can be kind of whatever you want it to be. Next we're going to add some Worcestershire, however you choose to pronounce it. This is about 3 shakes of the sauce per pound. It's the best way that I could describe how you measure Worcestershire without breaking out the measuring spoons. And then some tomato paste. This is going to add just kind of some richness and it's going to help enforce the meatiness of the dish. That is about a tablespoon per pound. Finally, we're going to finish off with some binders. This is some panko breadcrumbs. It ends up being about 1/3 cup per pound. And this is important. Some people would skip this because I think it's a filler, but it's important because this will absorb some of the juice and fat that's going to come out of the meat that would otherwise be lost. And then the second binder I'm going to use, these are actually fried onions. So I like to just crunch them up a little bit. You can leave them whole. I've done that before, but they kind of create these weak points in the meatloaf because they don't really mix with the meat and the meat kind of falls apart around them. So just crunch them up in your hand. It ends up being about 1/3 cup per pound as well. And again, both of these serve to just absorb some of those juices, some of those fats, keep the meatloaf from drying out, and also maintain that flavor. And finally, we're going to season it. This is about a good 4-finger pinch of salt and pepper per pound. And then I'm going to add in a little bit of extra ground black pepper. I'd say maybe that's, 5 or 6 grinds per pound. A little bit more than that. And then we're going to go ahead and start mixing. Now, what you want when you mix a meatloaf is you want everything to be very homogeneous. You want it to be completely mixed together. You don't want any weird pockets of this or pockets of that, especially when you're dealing with multiple types of meat in one meatloaf, because if you have like a pocket of pork or a pocket of beef, it's not going to cook the same, it's not going to taste the same, which is the really important part. So mix it through. It took me about maybe 3 to 4 minutes to get it mixed all the way through. And then you can see here, I'm just kind of quickly turning it over. I'm looking for just any spots that haven't been completely homogenized. But once you get there, I'm going to go ahead and pull off a little bit of a patty. And this is really important. Whenever you're making anything with ground meat, if you watch my cabbage roll video, I did the same thing. You want to create a tester. You want to create something that lets you taste it, because you don't know what this tastes like until you cook some of it. So if you just go in blind, you don't know what you're serving. So this takes all of maybe 3-4 minutes to prep up, but it really lets you know what it is that you're getting into. So with this finished, I took a taste, and I determined this needed a little bit more salt for my taste. You may come to a different conclusion, but that was just how I felt. And here you can see the meatloaf has good texture. It's a little bit springy. It's very juicy. But other than that, all the flavors were exactly what I wanted. So with the meatloaf finished off, we're going to go ahead and start forming. So I have a foil wrapped pan here. I do recommend that you wrap your pan in foil. I have destroyed a sheet pan with this recipe because I didn't wrap it in foil. And the first thing you're going to notice that I'm doing is I'm kind of pressing and squeezing the meatloaf. This is important because I want to get rid of any air pockets. I don't want there to be any cavities inside the meatloaf. That's a problem because then you go to cut it and then this cavity is a weak point and the whole thing will crumble and fall apart rather than having this nice slice. You'll also notice the shape. I find the shape is really important too, this kind of oblong football shape. It maximizes the surface area but creates a minimal distance to the center so that the meatloaf cooks pretty quickly. Now we're going to go ahead and get into the wrapping with the bacon. This is going to be kind of a long segment because people do this wrong a lot. I did it wrong for a very long time and I want to make sure that you don't. So the first thing you'll notice is when you're wrapping something in bacon, bacon is not even. There's a fat side and a skinny side. So as you wrap it with the bacon, you want to tessellate the bacon. So the fat side's on the right and the fat side's on the left. The fat side's on the right, the fat side's on the left. This ensures you don't get that gap that you're seeing right there. You also want to make sure, this is confusing because I just said the fat side, but there's a meat portion on the bottom half of the bacon and then the fat cap on the top half. Keep those the same way. It just makes it look nicer, I think. Another thing you'll notice when I'm wrapping this is there's a slight bit of overlap. I'm like lobstering this a little bit. This is because bacon shrinks when it cooks. And if you have it set up exactly like on the edge of one another, what happens is as it cooks, it then retracts a little bit and then you have areas that are no longer covered with bacon. And this recipe does take about 1 whole pound of bacon. This is a little excessive, and yeah, it is a little excessive, but you know, it's tasty, so why not? Now I'm just starting to tuck the bacon under. I didn't try to do that while I was wrapping the whole thing. And what I'm doing here is I'm just gently working the ends of the bacon underneath the meatloaf. This is important, and I'll cover this in just a second in the video. You don't want to stretch the bacon. Like, you don't want to stretch it tight like that because, again, bacon will retract as it cooks. And then if it's stretched tight, it'll then either break or crack, or you'll end up with places where you don't have good coverage anymore. So very gently, very loosely wrapped, and then just tuck it under. Don't pull it taut. And I'm just kind of working it underneath with my fingertips. And once you get it mostly under, just to kind of make sure that everything is nice and clean, I'm going to use both hands and just rotate the meatloaf, kind of lean it on one side, and then we're going to fold all these loose ends underneath. And you could say this isn't fully wrapped, but the part that matters is wrapped. The meatloaf will be presented kind of in this fashion, so the bottom not having completely wrapped in bacon is not a huge deal, at least not to me. There I went. Go ahead, tighten everything up. Again, don't stretch it too tight. And then I had this one piece left over. I wasn't going to put a piece of bacon back in the fridge. So just leave it right on top, a little bit of a garnish. Or decorative, I guess. With the meatloaf done, we're going to go ahead and start getting the glaze together. It's mostly ketchup. I add a little bit of barbecue sauce. It doesn't matter. You may recognize the bottle, but this is just more for add some sweetness and add some consistency. Whatever your favorite barbecue sauce is. Next, we're going to add a little bit of good mustard. This is good stone ground mustard. You could use yellow mustard, but I find the flavor you get from this is a lot better. A little bit of liquid smoke. We're going to add in some more black pepper. And then a little bit more granulated onion. Granulated onion is a great product. I treat it almost like salt sometimes. It's just like very good general seasoning. It's not less of a flavor, more of a seasoning to me. So we're going to get this over low heat, stir it together. The reason that we're cooking it over low heat is because I want to reduce the moisture in this pot a little bit. If you don't reduce the moisture, what happens is when you put this under the broiler, when you put it on the meatloaf under the broiler, it just kind of boils because the moisture in the glaze kind of absorbs all that heat, and instead of kind of charring and caramelizing, it just kind of bubbles on top and you don't really get a whole lot done. So by drying it out a little bit like this, it makes it glaze a lot better. And again, you would think by looking at it, it's fairly thick. It's not wet. You know, it doesn't look wet, but there is a decent moisture content in there. And here you can see after it's been cooked down a little bit, it kind of slides rather than pours, and that's what you're looking for. It's thickened up. It's kind of coagulated is the wrong word. So meatloaf goes in the oven. Start at 45 minutes. I do 400 degrees at 45 minutes and then assess from there. Everybody's oven's a little bit different depending on how it cycles, depending on where your racks are. This is 45 minutes later. You can see it looks pretty done, but the bacon on the outside is looking a little flabby and sad. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back in for a little bit longer. After the initial 45 minutes, I recommend do maybe 15-minute increments. So this is 15 minutes later. You can see the bacon has finally browned up. It's got a nice golden brown color to it. You can see all the slag and like goop coming off the side of the meatloaf. That's why you want to wrap that pan in foil. And we're going to go ahead and glaze this. I glaze it twice, so I put about half the glaze on first. We'll put it in there, put it back in the oven for about 15 minutes, and then put another round of glaze on, and then broil it to finish. So just go ahead, get the glaze on there, and just kind of evenly spread it around with a spoon. I have a pastry brush, but not everybody does, and I like to try to avoid using what I would consider to be specialty equipment as much as possible. So just rub it around with a spoon. It doesn't have to be perfect. As it heats up, it'll kind of melt down and kind of cover the meatloaf that way. But do your best to kind of cover it up. So another 15 minutes has gone by. And you can see the glaze has gotten nice and dark. It's really kind of baked into the outside of the meatloaf. So we're going to go ahead and cover it one more time, and then we're going to broil this. Now, you can skip this step. You could just bake it again. You could put all the glaze on in the first place, just do a real heavy coat, and put it in for 15 minutes. You're not going to hurt anything. I find baking the first round of glaze and then broiling the second round of glaze just offers a better flavor, because you get the base glaze, and then you also get the caramelized bit from the broiler. So here you can see it's starting to char a little bit. That's okay. That's how I like this. It looks a little burnt, but it adds flavor to everything. I'm rotating it around because my broiler doesn't cook terribly evenly. So in order to get it off the pan now that we're finished, go ahead, work some forks around the side just to kind of free it from the pan, and then stab in from either side and just quickly transport it over. If you've made the meatloaf correctly, if you squeezed out all the air pockets like we did when we were forming it, it will do this because it's a nice solid piece. It doesn't have any structural weaknesses. So I did let this rest for about 15 minutes. You can still see there's quite a bit of juice coming out. And it would be a lot more if we hadn't added the binding agent in the form of the panko and the fried onions. Once again, this is a very easy recipe because you can whip it up ahead of time, park it, and then come back to it and put it in the oven when dinner time comes around. It slices really nicely because it's a nice, dense, heavy meatloaf. Here I'm presenting it with just a little bit of vegetables and a slice of homemade sourdough, which is some foreshadowing for a future episode. As always, I thank you for watching. Please like, favorite, comment, share, and subscribe.